and welcome to a World Shift Conversation. Today we have the great pleasure of speaking with Jefferson Cann. Jefferson Cann is the co-founder of Extraordinary Leadership. He has a 23-year career in international corporate world, and Jefferson Cann has worked to enable a culture of leadership that recognizes the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual levels of the self. So welcome, Jefferson.
Thank you, Kingsley.
To begin with, I'd like to open with a broad picture and to ask you to give some details to your background and why you left a successful international career after 23 years to focus on leadership transformation.
Yes, thank you, Kingsley. Well, I left that mainly because of my experiences of leadership, or lack of it, within there, and the effects that the crudity and the focus of the corporate world had upon the people within it. Over that period of time, I, as you say, had an international career and saw it in many aspects. I've always had an interest in the development of the human being, of the human evolution and consciousness. And as the material needs that I felt were being met for my family lessened over the years, as the kids got older and were able to look after themselves more and more, the need I had to explore and express that other side of myself became more urgent. So in the end, I just couldn't, I had to leave so much of myself at home every day to go into the office. It became impossible, so I had to make the leap. And about 8 or 9 years ago, I trained as a coach, an executive coach. And over the intervening period, my interest in leadership has become primary. And now all of my work, both at the individual, the team, and the organizational level, focuses on leadership development.
Thank you, Jefferson. Going to the actual title of company you co-founded, Extraordinary Leadership. Now, I'm assuming that's not just a semantic wording. Extraordinary. Why is it?
This relates initially to where the company came from. I was working with my business partner and co-founder, Nigel Linacre, in Africa. He had a link with a school there, a poor rural school in the middle of nowhere in Kenya. And after having been out there and realized how powerful that place was, it was developed and run by 2 retired teachers. And they'd built an incredibly high-performing organization with over 200 pupils, with nothing on the farm that they owned. And they themselves represented a level of leadership and a breadth of leadership that would neither of us had ever encountered in our work in the corporate world here in the UK and Europe and the US. And so we decided that some of our clients would benefit greatly from going over there and experiencing what leadership was and what it could provide in ways that they had no experience of. So we took people out there and we realized a number of things. One, that we go out there, we're staying in an African hotel, and they're in the middle of nowhere in Africa. They're confronted with hundreds of African children, with African teachers, some of whom are suspicious of these white guys coming over, or the Mzungu, as they call us. And they are stripped of everything, as we were when we first went, stripped of everything that supports who we think we are, how important we think we are, what we think we need, what we think we can do, and what we think we can't do. Stripped of all of that. Within the first 24 hours, most of our clients come up to us and say, "Oh, God, what am I doing here again? Remind me why I came." And we say, "Good question. What can you contribute to this community of yourself? By the way, you've got 3 days to do it because the plane goes in a few days." And they find that despite being stripped of everything, they can relate directly to the people around them and contribute directly from themselves without any of the things they used to feel they needed in order to be able to make a contribution to the world they lived in. So by stripping away all of these supports, dimensions of themselves became accessible. Physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual dimensions became accessible to themselves, both to explore but also to give from. Dimensions and aspects of themselves that were literally inaccessible in their year-to-year lives. So Nigel and I having experienced this a number of times, thought, how can we bring some of this transformational experience from Africa to the meeting rooms, the hotel rooms in Surrey or in Berlin or Boston that we work in? How can we bring some of the depth of that transformational impact into the work we do? So those journeys were called extraordinary leadership journeys, because extraordinary they certainly were. And when we developed our current work on that basis, we of course called it extraordinary leadership, because the depth that we work at and the impact that we have, we know from our previous work and from what our clients tell us, is extraordinary in the leadership development world.
So it sounds there, Jefferson, that you're in changing the cultural context, you're dealing with also a kind of deconditioning of the self as well. Now, that brings me to some of your work. You've written about the path of leadership, and you talked about this path involving harmonic sensing and harmonic resonance. Now, I'm familiar with those words, but people in leadership studies may not be familiar with that. Does this tie in with what you've been talking about the cultural deconditioning?
Yes, very much so, and well spotted on that, Kingsley. The shock and impact of turning up at this rural place is, if you like, enforced deconditioning. And the emotional impact of the children coming up and meeting people, of course, blows away a lot of those emotional defenses that we have. Coming back in, we developed a number of exercises and approaches to enable that deconditioning to occur at the individual level. And I think it's probably worth outlining the framework we use to achieve this, which will help leadership practitioners understand how it fits with any of the models and frameworks that are currently in popular use out there. It's quite simple, and yet because of the focus it ends up with, it's incredibly powerful. Leaders work in time. They go from wherever they are in the present moment towards a desired future along a path that intervenes. So we have the now, we have the future, and we have the path in between in time. As well as that, they work in space. The initial space is the space of self. If you cannot lead yourself, you cannot lead anything, let alone other people. You can react. You can bring past behavioral patterns and dump them on the moment and hope that that fits and will get you somewhere towards the future you want to go. But that's not leadership. That's reactivity. Of course, the second space that the leader leads is the team or the other people or the community. And those two spatial dimensions are really where leadership stopped until the last 20 years. You know, if you look at a community, the community was, we need to make sure we're okay, and it doesn't really matter what effect that has on other people. The corporate responsibility, as enshrined in law, is still limited to those two spatial dimensions. As CEO, my responsibility would be to ensure the profitability and shareholder value of my organization at the expense of the competition, not let alone working harmoniously with them, but, you know, it was, there's limited resources, I'll grab them and you can go hang if you want to. So, and at the national level, of course, we see it through all of history. The national leader's responsibility is to ensure the well-being of the nation, and wherever necessary, that is directly at the expense of other nations that might be perceived to be impinging upon that individual's national interest. However, in the last 20 years, with the understanding of the interconnectivity of everything, from the individual to the group to the national and the international levels, of course, everybody has become increasingly aware of the nature and necessity of assessing and being aware of the global impact of everything we do. So every organization that we work with at the moment will have a CSR, a corporate social responsibility program. Some will take that seriously and become incredibly involved with the organizations they support. Others will just pay lip service and give a number of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands to some organizations, have a nice paragraph in their annual report and leave it at that. But this bespeaks this understanding that the third level the third spatial dimension of leadership, the world, is now real. It is an active aspect of leadership consciousness. So that means we have three spatial dimensions: self, others, and the world, and we have three time dimensions: now, the future, and the path in between. And again, that is essentially where much leadership literature stops. It focuses on the individual's impact upon others to achieve group or even personal goals. However, in all of these, if you bring in the spiritual dimension, you immediately bring in that third dimension. So the framework we work with is a three-dimensional framework. And that third dimension is the being of the leader themselves. And people talk about the act of leadership. The act of leadership is actually the indicator of that third dimension, the being of the leader. Whatever the leader does, and whatever dimension of time or space that leader is working in, there are three aspects that are essential: the awareness that the leader has, the ability of that leader to connect with themselves, with the others, and with the world, and the transformational nature of the actions of the leader. So let's take first, if we may, awareness. There's a lot been written in the last few decades about emotional intelligence. Self-awareness is the core of emotional intelligence. The level that we understood people were working at when we were in Africa, if you remember that, meant that we understood that for leadership of self to happen, it has to work at the neurophysiological level. One of the fundamental traits of corporate life and of our social life is fear. Interestingly, we live in a society and an environment in the developed world, as we call it, of gross, almost obscene abundance. Just stand outside, the back door of a restaurant when it closes at 1 o'clock in the morning, walk into a department store or, a supermarket, and that gross abundance is on display. And yet, despite this, we have a mentality of scarcity. I just better get one more of those, or I better get a new one. And all of the brainwashing for the consumptive society that you delineate so well in the battle for your mind is there. And there's all the understanding we have of from the 1950s about how advertising is used, psychology, to develop this sense of scarcity on the basis of fear. That fear pervades everything, and you can see that in the parent-child feudal aspects of corporations, and you can see it in the so-called war on terror or war on drugs that pervades most of our public space these days, and the fear of underlying the economic problem that we have. I never quite understood how an economic crisis that resulted from the greed and fear in private banks suddenly became a public accountancy, a public expenditure problem, but seemingly it is. There we go. So that fear, to deal with that, particularly at the leadership level, we have to work deep within the individual to enable the individual to develop the ability to move from the state of fear, which at the neurophysiological level is indicated by the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. Adrenaline, fear, tension, anxiety, reactivity, aggression, fight or flight. And to be able to move almost instantly from that to the parasympathetic state, which is one of openness, of receptivity, of perception, of connectedness, of increased awareness, and the ability to allow the psychological state of flow to occur. And flow, as developed by Csikszentmihalyi and Galway and Whitmore, is that state of the highest level of awareness, connection, and performance that an individual can attain. And it's, every professional sportsman knows that, where performance is important. So self-leadership comes down, and I know Kipling has been unpopular, but he really puts it best when he talks about the ability to keep your head when all about are losing theirs and blaming it on you, which as the leader is when the proverbial really hits the fan and you have to really hold the line. So our work, we say, is extraordinary because we work at that level. We provide tools, very simple self-management tools, to enable the individual to manage their stress and anxiety, their fear, very quickly and very powerfully. We then work with them to really deeply link through to their sense of purpose at the individual level, so that we ground them in their own personal sense of purpose within the context of the years that they have existing on this planet, and enable them to understand and deal with that concept of the temporality of existence, which of course in general parlance is swept under the carpet, and actively worked against. Because once people understand that they are unique, that they are a unique manifestation of whatever they think they are a manifestation of, and that the purpose, and we do think there is a purpose to that unique manifestation, that unique existence, their purpose is to reveal, explore, and express that uniqueness and give of that into the whole, into the world, for the purpose of the greater good, of helping the development of the greater good, then, of course, their orientation to everything they do changes. They might well end up going into the same job day after day, but their relationship to that job has been transformed. And therefore, the effect they have upon the people they work with, upon the purpose of the activities they do, is also transformed. And as leaders, that transformed awareness, their ability to more deeply connect with themselves and others, transforms the work they do and their leadership activity. Because when you look at the act of leadership as awareness and connection and transformation, the higher the quality of awareness at any level determines the quality of connection that is available with self, with others, with the world. The quality of awareness, or let's say if you improve the quality of awareness and connection, that is itself transformational of the relationship with self, with others, and with the world. From the leadership perspective, it also means that the transformation possible through the intentional leadership activity of the leader is also transformed and becomes far more powerful. But it becomes powerful not in the satisfaction of the leadership's individual ego-based, fear-based self, but it becomes transformational because of those new awarenesses and connections at the level of the greater good, at the higher level of the individual leader's consciousness of their connection with all and everything around them.
Jefferson, that's wonderful. That was a very rich answer. And in fact, you've covered a lot of the areas that I was planning to ask you anyway. So you've, in a sense, done the job for me. Some of the points you touched on there that I also wanted to touch on, such as you mentioned the ancient truths of connectedness of all things now coming through, being validated by our sciences, and now being shown in manifestation through people connecting. That was one of the points I thought was quite significant, and you picked up on that. And also, you talked about the effects on the human brain and the awareness and perceptions being shifted through the brain, almost as if we're being rewired in a sense. When you talk about leadership for the greater good, and you talk about the social corporate responsibility, and therefore the responsibility to the larger community, I'd like to pick up on this sense of community. I'd like to ask you, how do you feel leadership will be developing with community, in symbiosis with community? That's one part of the question. And the second part is, Jefferson, when you talk about awareness, connection, transformation as leadership, leadership is not only, as you're fully aware, in the corporate field, but leadership within the self and within a person's community as well. So in terms of personal community leadership as well as corporate leadership community, how do you see this sense of community and leadership developing and its importance?
It is the important dynamic, I think. If we take, that's a really good question. If we take, try to think of a great example. Let's take an organization at the moment, an organization that is sincerely trying to live is corporate social responsibility. And we'll take a lead within that. One of the issues we see at the moment is, and we see this at the community level anywhere, in counseling, in coaching, in community development, in politics, both local, national, and international. This growing awareness is happening within the old environment. So I might be a highly motivated, community-orientated CEO, but I still have to report and give the numbers to a marketplace based upon greed and fear. Also, I might desperately be trying to do good, to be of benefit to the greater good. But that might well be based on an internal subconscious paradigm that I'm doing that because I want to be a good person, which is essentially, just like the CEO, still an ego-based, a self-orientated perspective. So leadership such as this can do an awful lot of good in the world, but it's still underneath, rooted in the ego. And the ego, if you like to speak in, if I can paraphrase some spiritual terms, the ego is a false construct and therefore is always trying to support itself and is based upon a fear that is recognizing its own falsity. There are all the great leaders in the world, all the great, I almost said mythical leaders, but they actually exist, the Gandhis, the Mandelas of this world, the great spiritual leaders, provide examples of how not ego-based individuality, but the individuality of a higher consciousness that actually perceives and lives the interconnectedness of everything and is able to manifest it on this level. They provide us with examples for this. And of course, trying to emulate that in leadership terms is the aim of all spiritual and emotional-based leadership and servant-based leadership development. To overcome that, though, we have to come right back to work at the ego-based level. If we take a community example, and Mandela comes to mind here, Nelson Mandela. There's a great film, and I use it not just because I'm a rugby fan as well, because it shows how that consciousness, that higher level consciousness, could be manifested through leadership in the ego fear-based level of community. When Mandela came to power and in South Africa, the apartheid regime collapsed. He was head of the ANC, which of course was very proud of its ability to have destroyed the apartheid system and society. It was still a very, very much divided society, with the power and the wealth in the whites and the black community desperate to change things and to spread the wealth and the power. However, there was a Rugby World Cup coming up in a couple of years, 1995, and Mandela recognized that that could be the means of achieving community healing and community wholeness. The only problem is the Springbok rugby team was the absolute symbol of hated white supremacy. So much so that the black community would always support the opposition whenever it was playing. Within 2 years, Nelson Mandela, working selflessly and working for the higher vision he had of community integration, not of just shifting the power balance, but of creating something wholly new at the community, the national community level, managed to get the whole of South African society supporting the Springbok rugby team. It went from being the hated symbol of white repression to the symbol of the Rainbow Nation, of the regeneration of the whole nation community. And when he walked out in the final, which strangely South Africa won, wearing the Springbok captain's rugby shirt and a Springbok cap, it symbolized not the moment of a rugby achievement, but this moment of the transformation of a nation, and therefore the possibility of transformation at the global level. Magnificent story. Mm-hmm. And that came around because of Nelson Mandela's awareness of himself and of the community and of his role within the community, of his ability to subsume his ego needs, such as they were after these 27 years in prison, for the greater good of the nation and of the world, of which the nation was an incredible example. His connections with himself, with his communities, and his ability to create connections with all aspects of the South African and the international community, and his ability to create connections within the white community, whatever the history thereof, enabled a transformation at the individual, national and international level that otherwise would have been impossible. So it is this shift from the ego-based perspective for the leader and for the communities in which the leader leads, to that level of higher consciousness that actually lives the awareness of the interconnectedness of all life that will develop and in the future determine the transformation of human community and therefore the global community in all its varied aspects.
That's an excellent example, Jefferson. You're probably also referring to the film Invictus that was made of Mandela's work here. Yeah?
Yes. I mean, if you watch it and you're a rugby fan, forgive them for the rugby, but the message, the message is fantastic.
Yeah. And what you're putting forth here is that a leader, whatever their position, whether a leader of a country, a corporation, a community, a family, it's the embodying the self-transformation and selfless non-ego is part of that true quality of leadership. And if I'm right, that's what you're putting forth.
Absolutely, Kingsley. And the indicator is fear. Mm-hmm. It is always fear, and fear manifests itself, as we know. The quickest, when I talk to people about how do they know they're becoming, I ask them two questions most times in our workshop. How do you know you're happy? What's the first thing you see that tells you you're happy? And I have a silence and a bemused look, because people probably don't think about that. They just say, well, I don't know really. I find myself smiling, or there's an energy. Mm-hmm. And when I say, okay, how do you know you're becoming anxious? People instantly know. Or it's tension here, it's tension in the shoulder, it's a headache, it's getting angry, it's a closing down of this. We're far more acutely aware of our fear than we are of our lack of fear, because we work with it so much. So people are very aware of when they are acting through fear. The tightening of the muscles, the tightening of the solar plexus, the shallow breathing, all these symptoms we have of our fight or flight syndrome being triggered. Mm-hmm. Because of that, when we teach the tools to manage that, it can create the space for the awareness and the connectivity to enter. If we are acting under fear or tension, there is no space for connection, because that is overridden by our connection with our lower ego-based self, fear of survival. Mm-hmm. If we're acting under that, the possibilities of connecting with the greater good are denied, because we are always putting our own ego-based individual self before everything else. Mm-hmm. And this happens also, we know this happens. Even if we're trying to be the best parent, we know that when we snap at our children or we get angry with them, we know we're denying our higher selves, which is why when we remember that, it hurts so much, because it is with our children when we know that we need, and while the highest desire is to act through the love we have for them, we know that how much it hurts when we deny that. It's probably the most potent arena for realizing how when we act from fear, we're denying that higher self.
Now, I find that very empowering to have someone in your position talking about the connection with the higher self and love and happiness in the context of which you're working, Jefferson. And one of the phrases which I've come across in your work, and you say that leadership is not about being the best, or the most aware, or the most humble. Now, these are qualities which most people would associate with leadership. But you say, in fact, leadership is about understanding one's sense of purpose and playing their true role. And how do you find people react to this?
I find people are desperately hungry for it. Desperately hungry for it. To use the phrase we used before, we are all unique manifestations of creation, whatever, wherever we may think that comes from. Mm-hmm. And that lived within. T.S. Eliot, in one of his poems, talks about looking at old ladies and seeing them chatting and being aware of this infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing within. And in my work, I find that everybody, that inner self, that deeper, and you know the paradox, the more deeply into ourselves we go, the higher the level of consciousness we're able to touch. So there's that, that beautiful paradox. So when we talk to people about discovering their purpose, about living what they believe to be true, knowing that the living of that truth will change that truth as they grow and as they experience and as they understand more, so that truth will grow. As we talk to them about fulfillment of purpose, about understanding their relationship through being, not doing. In the corporate world, we try to forget that that people are human beings. We desperately try and force ourselves to see everybody as human doings and to treat them as functions. As soon as we bring the being back into it, as soon as we bring that connection with our own being back into it, it transforms relationships. And the response to our work by bringing this in. I'm interested by that other aspect that you mentioned. Because we work in an ego-driven world, I also see that a lot of the discussion about spiritual leadership, a lot of the discussion about servant leadership is perceived and enacted unconsciously through the ego level. So people do try to be the best servant. They try and be the most humble. So that whole competitivity, that whole scarcity mentality comes in, you know? Mm-hmm. How do I know I'm being the best? Well, I'm being the best because I have to compare myself. As soon as comparison comes in, we're in the ego world. I don't care what parameter we work in. I don't care what value we're working with. We are in the ego-based world. There is no comparison because there is nothing to compare ourselves to. The uniqueness of ourselves and our own being and the value that to the greater whole that is provided through the fulfillment of that uniqueness is incomparable. Mm-hmm. So by starting deep within that individual perspective and purpose, exploring what that is the route of accessing that higher consciousness and therefore providing leadership at the level the world most obviously requires, or not provide, let's say, of enabling the flow of that new consciousness to come into the world more fully, more quickly, and more completely, and more beneficially than would otherwise be the case. You
talked there, Jefferson, about the most humble being an ego-based behavior, and that reminded me of the story of two so-called spiritual gurus meeting each other, and when they met, one bowed deeply in humility, the other one bowed even deeper to be more humble, and the other one had to bow even more deeply, and soon they was on the floor.
Absolutely.
Now, the last sentence you said about a new consciousness coming through, I'd like to ask you about that. Have you noticed or have you any experience in the younger generation manifesting this consciousness? Because when we talk about leadership, automatically the stereotype is an older person, but that is not necessarily have to be the case. And the younger generation now are being perceived to be coming through as stronger leaders at a younger age. I mean, could you comment on that?
Yes. The phrase that came to mind was the child is father to the man, or the woman, or mother to the woman. Absolutely. If you look at the results of fear-based parenting, you can see it everywhere, the need to control. As a society, I think we betray our generations because we give them, in social terms, no indicator of what it really means to be an adult in our society. And we give no recognition of the transition from being a child or a young adult to an adult, to assuming responsibility at the social level. There's no ritual, there's no marking of that deep passage, and therefore we cut them adrift. We call it teenagers. And so many clients say, oh, my young kids are wonderful, but, oh, you wait until they're teenagers. And I go, no, don't say that. It's the most wonderful age when they are exploring this uniqueness of themselves. And all we can do is hopefully by then we've treated them in such an adult-to-adult fashion. We've provided them with the basis for them to explore that in a balanced way, that it becomes a journey of true exploration and discovery, not a journey of conflict and concern and fear. And yet, because of the pervasiveness of fear in our society, it all too often becomes that, I'm afraid. So the new generation, there's an increasing amount of literature talking about how people coming into employment at the moment have a much different perspective. They're making choices over lifestyle rather than over wealth. There's no expectation of working for the organization and subsuming themselves, their values, their sense of self-value and worth, of compromising that for the corporate good. They're making choices about what is the purpose of the organization? What does it serve? What is its relationship to the broader perspective? What is its impact upon the environment? What is it? How does it treat its people? What is its relationship with its community, and how well does it serve that? There's a lot of literature coming through about how when people are making employment decisions, even within the so-called crisis that we're experiencing at the moment, that these are paramount objectives. The entrepreneurialism of young people is coming to the fore. They don't want to work for organizations. They want to work in ways that may clearly not lead to hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars a year. They want to work in ways that enable them to express themselves and integrate themselves with communities and with value sets that are important to them. And they're not looking for that to be instilled from outside. People coming through is obvious, I think, in some of the changes happening in the world and the repressive reaction of some of the old-fashioned fear-based power structures that are there. Egypt, with its elections going on at the moment, looking at what's happening in Saudi Arabia, where 60%, I think it is, are under 21, and the ruling class are all over 70. Mm-hmm. And what they're trying to do there with the death of the heir apparent. So these potential conflicts are coming through, and it is really the breaking, the cracking of the chrysalis of the old ego-based power order. I often think of a snake, and a young snake, when it outgrows its skin for the first time, and the skin begins to harden and stiffen. And the snake must begin to think, oh, my God, what's happening to me? And then, oh, fear of fear, horror of horror, its skin begins to crack and creak. What's happening? My skin is cracking. And then suddenly, that begins to fall off. And so, that feels better. Oh, look at this. Oh, wow, look at this. This old dead stuff falling off. Look at my shiny new skin and how much more comfortable it feels. And, that's better. And then I don't know about the snake world. It probably forgets before it happens again. It has to go through that, like humanity forgets of what it goes through. But it's almost as though at the species level, we're hitting another one of those moments. You talk very eloquently in your work about this shift, this evolutionary shift of consciousness, the disruption that occurs when that happens. But it seems to be within the awareness that the non-tangible being of humanity is at a level that it can bear the disruption that will occur, because we have so many manifestations of that growing species consciousness, the internet, the conversation we're having now, the growth of spirituality and the spiritual awareness. The fact that in many of our societies you can walk into a bookshop and pick up any book you like. You can access any piece. This is a phenomenon that, as far as we know, has never existed in our society. It is a resource that has never been available to humanity before. Mm-hmm. And if we think that the tangible is always a secondary manifestation to the intangible, I think it bodes well for us as the future goes.
Mm-hmm. I would agree, Jefferson. I think it does bode well for us, partly because I will not accept any other alternative. You talked about this conflict on the dead skin as the new consciousness and the new self is coming through. But going back to the dead skin, if you had the opportunity to stand at the United Nations in front of all the current leaders of the world, and you had 30 seconds to address them, what would you say to them, Jefferson?
I would talk about the inevitability of the changes that are to come, the inevitability of the evolution of humanity to an organism that understands and lives its whole interconnectivity, not only with itself, but with the whole of its environment, resonating with that, finding its true place as it resonates at its true harmonic with the universal symphony. And I would talk about the only thing that is holding us back is the ego-based fear of the animal soul within humanity. And that all the arguments they're having about resources, all the fear that they are manifesting within their societies because of their fear of accessing and of having enough of these rare resources, is the only thing that is holding back this evolutionary leap of humanity. And that it is not a matter of what they're doing for their organizations. It is each one of those leaders working to release themselves from their own fear, from their own lesser selves, that will release the communities, the nations, and therefore the world of which they appear, for which they appear to have responsibility at the moment. If they cannot do that, they will be cast aside, and their responsibility is to understand the degree of pain, of fear, of destruction that needs to happen, that will get in the way of that inevitability of the evolutionary flow. Sorry, got a bit carried away there.
That's a good 30 seconds.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's inspiring, Jefferson, and I find your own work very significant in the context you are operating. So where can people come to find your work? How can they find out more about what you're doing?
Of course, the website is the best place, letterxleadership.com. If they wanted to see more about the African journey, they can find a bit there. But also there is a Facebook page, Extraordinary Leadership Journey on Facebook, where people that have been on the journey put their pictures and their comments, and there are videos. And there's a great example in WellBoring.org. WellBoring is a charity that was set up by some engineers that came with us to the African community. And it shows how their increased awareness transformed themselves and led to the transformation of the community through the provision of clean water through a borehole well. And anywhere you look, and in one's own lives, the own lives I know of all of those I hope will listen to this, or all those, we know that as soon as we become aware of something, we are connected, and that transforms our relationships and therefore what is possible for us to do.
Jefferson Cann, it's been a great pleasure to speak with you today. I'd like to thank you for world shifting with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity and for the honor of so doing, Kingsley.